Welcome to another deep dive with us. This time we're tackling, well, a pretty fascinating topic, but I'll admit it can be a bit complex too. We're diving into Kenneth Burke's A Rhetoric of Motives.
Oh, a classic.
Yes, and we're zeroing in on his concept of order today,
Okay, order.
right? And how it helps us unpack how meaning is created, and even how those meanings shape social structures. You could almost think of it as like sneaking into a grad school theory seminar,
Right.
but without the exams and pressure and all that.
Yeah, no 10-page papers to worry about here.
Exactly. So we're going to be looking at some pretty intriguing questions today, like how does meaning actually go beyond just simple words or images?
Interesting.
And are there like hidden agendas lurking behind ideas that seem, totally universal on the surface?
Now that one I'm really curious about.
Right. And we're even going to tackle this question. Can we analyze Shakespeare the same way we analyze, say, a comic book?
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah, that one definitely caught my eye too.
Right. So to jump in, Burke starts with this idea that symbols, they don't just reflect the things they represent, they actually go beyond that. They transcend them.
Okay.
It's like if you take the word tree as an example,
Right.
we probably all picture something a little different, but there's this shared understanding of what a tree is.
Just like this tree-ness.
Yes, exactly. That goes beyond any single image.
And what's really fascinating is that Burke, he doesn't stop there. He's building on the work of semioticians.
Okay, remind me. Semioticians are the folks who study.
Signs and symbols. They break things down into the sign, the thing that represents
Okay,
the signifier, the actual physical thing you see or hear,
got it.
and the signified, which is that shared concept. So with our tree example,
Right.
tree, the word, that's the sign. A tree you actually see, that's the signifier. And that treeness we were talking about, that's the signifier.
Okay, I'm following so far.
Now, what Burke argues is that meaning, like true deep meaning, is actually created in that shared understanding, in the signified.
So it's not just that we're like decoding some meaning that's already there, fixed and waiting.
Exactly. It's more dynamic than that. We're actually shaping meaning as we interact with these symbols.
Wow, that's actually pretty powerful if you think about it. It's like each of us is adding our own layer of meaning to everything we encounter, right?
That's a great way to put it. And this is where things start to get even more interesting because Burke connects this to stories.
Stories.
Yeah, remember Aristotle's ideas about, plot and how a story unfolds?
Oh, right.
Burke is suggesting that each step, each beat in a story can actually reveal a different kind of motivational principle.
So it's not just about the events themselves, but about the underlying values that are driving those events, like the moral of the story.
Precisely. And it really makes you wonder if we can use that same lens to understand, real life events too.
Ooh, interesting.
Right. Like what are the deeper forces at play in the world around us? Are we all kind of like, acting out some big narrative without even realizing it?
Now that's a thought-provoking question.
Well,
You're definitely making me look at things differently. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, Burke also brings in some Marxist ideas. He suggests that even principles that seem totally universal, they can actually favor certain groups over others.
right. And that's where the idea of unmasking comes in.
Unmasking.
It's like looking for those hidden power dynamics behind any idea, even one that seems really neutral at first glance. Like whose interests are really being served here?
Okay, yeah, I think I'm starting to see where you're going with this. So can you maybe give me an example of how this unmasking works in practice? Like what kind of ideas might we need to unmask?
Sure. Think about the concept of freedom. On the surface, it sounds fantastic.
All right, who doesn't want more freedom?
Exactly. But if you dig a little deeper, you start to realize that, whose freedom is being prioritized really matters.
Oh, I see what you mean.
One person's freedom might actually mean, restrictions on someone else's freedom.
Whoa. I never thought of it that way. It's like there's this whole hidden layer of meaning that we miss if we don't pay attention.
Yeah.
So how do we start to see these hidden agendas? How do we avoid being manipulated by these ideas?
Well, Burke, he proposes this hierarchy of symbols to help us understand this. At the bottom, you have sensory images, things we experience with our senses, right?
Okay, makes sense.
Then, in the middle, you have ideas.
Uh-huh.
And then at the very top, the most powerful symbols are what he calls mythic images.
Mythic images. Okay, you're going to have to explain that one. It sounds a little fantastical. you know?
I know, it sounds a bit out there, right? But these mythic images are incredibly powerful because they shape our understanding of the world on a really deep level. Think about like cultural myths or even, religious beliefs.
Okay, yeah.
They're not just stories or ideas, they're tapping into these deep-seated emotional needs. And they offer explanations for these complex phenomena that are, difficult to understand otherwise.
So it's about um, finding comfort and stability in a world that can feel pretty chaotic.
Exactly. And because of that, because these mythic images are so powerful, we're often pretty hesitant to let go of them, even when faced with ideas that, might seem more rational or logical on the surface.
Ah, I see. So I'm starting to see the connection to order now. These mythic images are part of how we organize our world,
You
right?
got it.
And how we understand our place in it. They shape our motives and actions.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is that Burke argues we are sometimes even more motivated by these mythic images than by just pure ideas, even if those images might be, flawed or not entirely accurate.
So they can be incredibly persuasive, even if they're not, the whole truth.
Right, because they connect with us on an emotional level, not just an intellectual one.
Okay, wow, this is all starting to click for me now.
Hmm.
But I have to ask, where does Shakespeare fit into all of this? We haven't even mentioned him in like 20 minutes.
Right. Well, Burke actually uses Shakespeare's poem Venus and Adonis as a kind of case study to illustrate all of these concepts.
Venus and Adonis, okay.
He analyzes it through this lens of social hierarchy. So you can see how Venus, who represents the upper class, is begging favors from Adonis, who's more like the middle class.
Interesting.
And even the boar in the poem, believe it or not, represents the lower class.
The bore. Seriously, I never thought I'd see the day where we're comparing Shakespeare to like a comic book.
I know it sounds a bit wild, right? But Burke's point is that they both engage with these universal themes of power, conflict, and social order. He's not saying that Shakespeare is the same as a comic book. He's just showing us that these themes can be explored in all different forms of storytelling, from high literature to pop culture.
This is definitely making me rethink my high school English classes. It's like Brooke is saying that everything has a deeper meaning, even a comic book.
Exactly. And he gives us the tools to start unpacking those meanings and to understand how those meanings shape the world around us.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. I think I need a break to process all this.
Sounds good to me. We've covered a lot of ground.
So, we've been talking about how Kenneth Burke's idea of order helps us understand how meaning is made, you know, and how those meanings can really impact our lives. It's not just the words and pictures themselves, it's the underlying power dynamics and these mythic images that shape our whole worldview.
Right. And what's fascinating is how Burke ties all of this to the idea of identification. Like, he argues that we're always looking for ways to bridge different realms, the celestial and the social, or the literal and the symbolic.
Okay, so you're saying that we're always searching for that common ground, even if the connection, even if it's based on shared myths or beliefs, might not be completely accurate.
Exactly. We're trying to find those points of identification. And Burke suggests that this whole process of identifying, it's actually super motivational, Like, it drives our actions and shapes how we understand the world.
Okay, so you mean example. How does this play out in everyday life?
Well, think about how politicians use language, right? They use it to appeal to our emotions, to make us feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves.
Oh, I see that all the time. Like those big political rallies where everyone's waving flags and chanting slogans.
Exactly. They get caught up in this collective energy, this shared sense of identity and purpose. And Burke would say that's a key part of how rhetoric works. It's not just about logic and facts, it's about connecting on that emotional level.
But as we were talking about earlier, this whole identification thing, it can be used for, for good or for bad.
Absolutely. It really all comes down to the motives of the person speaking and what message they're really trying to get across. And that's why it's so crucial to be aware of how rhetoric is being used, to be critical. You need to question those underlying assumptions and really think about the information you're receiving.
So how do we actually get better at that? At critical thinking? How can we avoid being, manipulated by these techniques?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. Burke doesn't necessarily give us like a step-by-step guide, but he does encourage us to be aware of how rhetoric works, to question those big sweeping narratives, and to always be a little skeptical of those in power.
Yeah, to remember that everyone has an agenda, even if it's not totally obvious.
Right, there's always something going on beneath the surface, and that's true in all sorts of situations, not just politics.
Okay, so I know we've been talking a lot about Shakespeare, but I'm curious how these mythic images show up in our world today. What are some examples that, our listeners might encounter in their daily lives?
Hmm. Well, let's take the American dream, for example.
Okay, the American dream.
Right. It's this incredibly powerful image that's been around for centuries, influencing American culture. It promises upward mobility, success, happiness, all that stuff. And it's all attainable, supposedly, through hard work and determination.
Right, right. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, all that.
Exactly. So it's not just an idea, it's this symbol that carries a ton of emotional weight. It can
Yeah.
really shape how people make decisions.
So it motivates people to work hard to chase that dream, even if the odds aren't great.
Yeah, that's the power of a mythic image. But it can also be used to justify things like, inequality, to suggest that if someone hasn't achieved the American dream, well, they must not have worked hard enough.
That's a great example. It shows how these mythic images can be like inspiring on one hand,
Yeah.
but also kind of dangerous on the other. It depends how they're used, I guess.
Totally. They can be tools for control or sources of hope. It all depends on who's using them and for what purpose, and that's what we need to pay attention to.
You mentioned earlier that Burke compared Shakespeare to comic books, and I'm still kind of stuck on that. It seemed, I don't know, like a pretty bold statement.
It is bold,
Hmm.
but I think it's actually really insightful. What he's getting at is that both Shakespeare and comic books, despite their differences, they both deal with these universal themes like power, conflict, social order, the big stuff.
So it's not about saying one is better than the other. It's about recognizing that these human themes show up everywhere.
Exactly. It's a reminder that rhetoric isn't just for fancy speeches and debates, it's in everything. Movies, TV, music, ads, even those little memes we share online, it's all around us.
This is making me look at everything in a new light. Like Burke's giving us a whole new way to understand the world, from high art to pop culture and everything in between.
And what's even more powerful, he gives us the tools to decode those messages, to see those hidden agendas, and to become more critical consumers of information.
Right.
Like we can start to see the strings being pulled, the way things are working behind the scenes.
I love that. It's like he's giving us this secret superpower.
Yeah, knowledge is power, right? It helps us see the world differently, make better choices.
Speaking of seeing things differently, earlier you mentioned something about Burke connecting the boar in Venus and Adonis
Mhm.
to the idea of a scapegoat. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Oh, sure. So in the poem, Adonis is killed by this boar, but Burke argues that the boar is really just a stand-in, a symbol for the lower class. The boar gets blamed for Adonis's death, even though it was Venus, with her relentless pursuit, that actually caused the whole tragedy.
So you're saying the boar is being blamed unfairly, like it's a way to avoid taking responsibility for the real problem.
Exactly. And Burke's point is that this idea of scapegoating, it's not just some ancient literary device. It's still very relevant today.
Oh, I bet. Can you give some examples of how this plays out in our society now?
Sure. Think about how often immigrants are blamed for economic problems or social unrest.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that.
It's easier to point the finger at someone who's different, who's an outsider, than to actually deal with these complex systemic issues. Or consider how certain groups are stereotyped, blamed for crime, even if the statistics don't back that up.
That's a really powerful example. It shows how easy it is to fall into this trap of blaming others without seeing the bigger picture.
It's human nature to want simple explanations for complex problems, and it's often just more convenient to blame someone else rather than face the real issues head on.
But Burke's work, it gives us a way to see these patterns, to challenge them.
Right. That's exactly right. He gives us the language, the framework to analyze these scapegoating patterns and say, hey, wait a minute, something's not right here.
That's incredible. It's like he's giving us a toolkit for social change.
You can definitely say that. He's empowering us to be more aware of how rhetoric is used to manipulate and control and to stand up against it.
So we spent this whole deep dive exploring Kenneth Burke's rhetoric of motives, and particularly his idea of order. It's really about seeing those like hidden meanings and motivations behind, well, all the messages we're bombarded with every day, right?
Yeah, and it's pretty amazing how much we've uncovered just by looking at this one concept.
It really is. Burke gives us this whole framework for understanding how people use communication, like all the techniques they use to try and persuade us and shape our beliefs, even our actions.
It's like we've been given this secret decoder ring to see through all the BS.
Uh-huh, exactly. I love that analogy. So speaking of decoding, we've talked a lot about these mythic images
Mhm.
and how they can really influence how we see the world.
Right. Can you give our listeners some practical advice on how to spot these mythic images in their own lives? Like where should they be looking?
Absolutely. Start by thinking about those ideas or beliefs that, well, that just seem unquestionable. The ones that, trigger strong emotions or maybe even feel like kind of sacred.
Okay, so not just like literal myths and fairy tales.
No, not at all. These mythic images, they can be anywhere. Our
Mm.
language, our institutions, even our everyday conversations.
Okay, so it's not always obvious. Got it.
Yeah.
But once we've identified these mythic images, what then? What are we supposed to do with that knowledge? How do we stop ourselves from being manipulated by them?
The most important thing is to ask critical questions, like whose interests are actually being served by this myth?
Okay, who's benefiting?
Right. What are the potential consequences, if we just accept this myth as like the absolute truth? And are there other perspectives, maybe ones that are being silenced or ignored, that we should be considering? So it's all about being aware of like potential biases,
Yeah.
the hidden agendas that might be shaping these mythic images.
Exactly. We need to remember that even myths that seem totally harmless can have these unintended consequences, Like, take the myth of the self-made person.
Ooh, yeah, that's a big one.
On the surface, it's inspiring, right?
Pull yourself up by the bootstraps.
But it can also lead to this culture of individualism that kind of ignores the systemic inequalities that exist.
Yeah, it makes it seem like if you're not successful, it's your fault.
Yeah.
You didn't try hard enough.
Exactly. And Burke's work, it helps us to see these connections, right?
Right.
To understand how rhetoric is sometimes used to distract us from the real issues.
That actually reminds me of our discussion about scapegoating. You know,
Yeah.
how we tend to blame individuals for problems that are actually much bigger than any one person.
It's all connected. And Burke, he gives us the tools to see these patterns, to challenge them, and hopefully to start changing them.
Wow. I'm really starting to see how understanding Burke's ideas can help us become, well, better citizens, more informed, more engaged. It's not just about analyzing some old poem. It's about understanding how power and persuasion work in the real world.
Absolutely. Burke gives us these tools to see through all the smoke and mirrors and start making decisions for ourselves, not just blindly following along with whatever narrative we're being fed.
That's a powerful thought.
Yeah.
So we've reached the end of our deep dive, and I gotta say, I've learned so much. What's the one like key takeaway you'd want our listeners to walk away with? What's the most important thing to remember?
I think the biggest thing is just remembering that rhetoric is everywhere. It's not something that only politicians or advertisers use.
Right. It's not some like fancy thing we learn about in school and then never see again.
Exactly. It's how we communicate, it's how we make meaning, how we build connections with each other, even how we shape the world around us for better or for worse.
Wow. Okay, I'm gonna be looking at everything differently now.
Yeah. Haha. Good. So, my advice, pay attention. Pay attention to the language being used, ask questions, and don't be afraid to push back against those hidden agendas.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive into Kenneth Burke. It's been truly eye-opening.
The pleasure was all mine. And to everyone listening, keep questioning, keep exploring, keep diving deep. There's always more to learn.
Until next time, happy listening.